Hello and welcome to my channel. Are you ready for bed? Lean back, close your eyes, let the story take you away, and drift off to sleep peacefully. First, subscribe to my channel, and don't forget a commentant builamun. Karan Ligin, Baslan Gizi. Orals, Sajidunias, Girasna, imagine a world without electric light. A work where, once the sun dips below the horizon, darkness falls, a heavy curtain across every village, every road, every field. This was the world of medieval Europe. A continent stretching from the icy shores of Scandinavia to the sun-scorched edges of Mediterranean, bound together, not by roads or technology, but by faith, and the sphere and the slow turning of the seasons. We are somewhere between the years 900 and 300. The Roman Empire, which had once given the known world its roads, its laws, and its libraries, has been dust for centuries. In its absence, something new has grown, fragile, feudal, and deeply human. A civilization built on mud walls and wooden palisades, on the labor of millions of anonymous hands, on the prayers whispered in cold stone chapels before the first light of dawn. Tonight, we follow one night in this world, a single night, hungry, cold, and long, as it unfolds across the layers of medieval society. From the castle at the top of the hill to the peasant hut crouching in the valley below. From the monastery where monks chant in darkness to the marketplace, where a merchant guards his wares through the restless hours. This is not a romantic night. It is not a night of feasts and torchlight dancing, though those nights exist too. This is an ordinary night. And ordinary nights in the Middle Ages were anything but easy. To understand what hunger and exhaustion meant in this era, we must first understand the structure of the world these people inhabited. Medieval Europe was, at its core, an agricultural civilization. The vast majority of the population, estimates suggest somewhere between 80 and 90%, worked the land. They did not own it. They farmed it on behalf of lords, who owed allegiance to greater lords, who in answered to kings who claimed their authority from God. This was the feudal system, a pyramid of obligation, duty, and dependency that shaped every aspect of daily life, including sleep, including hunger, including the simple act of surviving a single night. The peasant at the base of this pyramid did not have the luxury of choosing when he worked or what he ate. His labor belonged, in large measure, to his lord. The produce of his fields was subject to rents and tithes, payments to the Lord and to the church that could consume a third or even half of everything he grew. What remained? What remained was kept his family alive through winter. And winter, in the medieval world, was the great test. It was the season when the stores ran low, when the body's demand for warmth competed directly with the body's need, and when the line between discomfort and death was thin and terrifyingly real. Tonight we are not quite in the dead of winter. We are in late autumn, October, perhaps, or early November. The harvest has come in, or most of it has. The fields are stripped and bare. The air smells of wood smoke and wet earth, and the nights have grown long enough to make people feel the darkness pressing against them like something alive. The food stores are freshest now, but that they must last until spring And every family in Reveille is already worrying, already beginning the long arithmetic of survival. Let us descend into this night. Let us begin where most lived in the medieval world began. In the village, Bialum-dus, Ka the Cresup. The village in mid-Europe was not a charming cluster of cottages, as later romanticized paintings might suggest. It was a working in community, practical and often harsh, shaped entirely by the demands of agriculture and the logic of survival. Most villages in England, France, Germany, or the Low Countries consisted of between a dozen and 100 households, gathered around a center on a central open space. Sometimes a green, sometimes simply a wide, muddy track, with the parish church marking the spiritual heart of the community. The houses themselves were simple constructions. In the early medieval period, many were built with wooden frames, with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks and clay or mud, and roofed with thatch. By the 12th and 13th centuries, stone construction had become more common, especially in areas where local stone was available. Even then, the interiors were dark, low-ceilinged, and smoky. Windows were small openings, covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters, not glass. Glass windows were luxury found only in churches, monasteries, and the homes of the wealthy. As the sun set on this autumn evening, the village would have taken on the quality of a living thing drawing inward. The livestock that had been grazing in the common fields, cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, were driven back into their enclosures or, in many cases, into the lower portion of the peasant house itself. This was not merely pragmatic, though it was certainly that. The animal's body heat contributed meaningfully to warming the living space above. A medieval peasant house was, in many gens, a long house, a single elongated structure divided internally, with the family occupying one end and the animals the other, separated by a low partition or simply by the floor level. This arrangement, which strikes modern sensibilities as primitive or unhygienic, was in fact a rational response to the realities of the climate and the economy. Animals were enormously valuable assets. A peasant family's oxen or horse represented the difference between being able to plow their fields and not being able to. Keeping them indoors protected them from theft, from predators, and from the killing cold. And the warmth they generated, along with the heat from the central hearth, was often what kept a family from freezing. The hearth was the center of the medieval home. In most peasant houses, it was not a fireplace set into a wall with a chimney. Architectural feature would not become common until later in the medieval period. And even then, it was initially associated with wealthier households. The hearth was simply a low, flat area in the middle of the floor where a fire burned, its smoke rising through a hole in the thatch above or simply filling the upper portion of the room and seeping out through the gaps in the walls and roof. This meant that the air inside a medieval home was perpetually smoky. Archaeological evidence and historical sources confirm that respiratory problems were extremely common among medieval populations. And the chronic inhalation of wood smoke throughout a lifetime was certainly a contributing factor. Now the fire is built up for the night. In a region of moderate wealth, the fuel might be seasoned oak or ash, hot-burning hardwood that would sustain the fire through the long hours of darkness. In poorer areas, or in regions where trees, the fuel might be peat, or dried animal dung, or bundles of reeds and bracken. The quality mattered enormously. A fire that burned hot and clean was a comfort. A fire that smoldered and smoked one's miseries was a misery, filling the room with it a choking haze while delivering insufficient warmth. Around this fire, the family gathers for the evening meal, and here we encounter the reality of medieval hunger. Not the dramatic hunger of famine, though famine was a recurring and terrible presence in this world, but the ordinary, daily hunger of a diet that was monotonous, often insufficient in calories and nutrition, and entirely dependent on what the season and the harvest had provided. The primary food of the medieval peasant was bread, not the soft, white, airy bread of modern bakeries, but a dense, coarse loaf made from rye, barley, or a mixture of grains, wheat, which produced the whitest and finest bread, was a luxury in Northern Europe. Its cultivation required better soil and more favorable conditions than the hardier grains could manage, and the white flour it produced was generally reserved for the tables of the wealthy. The peasant ate dark bread, heavy bread that was often several days old and had hardened to a consistency that required effort to. Alongside the bread, there might be a pottage, thick stew made from whatever vegetables were available. Peas, beans, and lentils were the primary protein sources for those who could not have meat. Turnips, parsnips, onions, and leeks were common vegetables. Cabbage, in various forms, was ubiquitous. The pottage would simmer in a pot suspended over the fire, and it might contain a small amount of salt pork or bacon. The pig's head had been slaughtered at Martinmas, the feast of Saint Martin Nun on the 11th of November, and whose flesh had been preserved in salt for the winter ahead. Salt was, in the medieval world, a substance of profound importance. Without refrigeration, salt's the primary means of preserving food. Fish, particularly herring and cod, was salted in vast quantities. Pork was salted. Butter was packed in salt. The salt trade was a major commercial enterprise, and control of salt resources was a matter of political and economic significance. A family that could afford good quality salt was a family better equipped to survive the winter. But let us return to the evening meal. The bread and pottage were set out, perhaps with a small piece of cheese, if the family kept a cow or goat, perhaps pickles or dried herbs to add flavor to an otherwise plain meal. There was ale, not the strong, heavily hopped beer of later centuries, but a mild, slightly sour fermented drink made from grain. Water in medieval Europe was not generally considered safe to drink populated areas, and with good reason. The same streams and wells that supplied drinking water also received the waste products of animals and humans. Ale, which had been boiled in its production, was considerably safer, and it was consumed in quantity by men, women, and children alike. Its alcohol content was low, probably 1 or 2% in the everyday variety, compared to modern beer at 5%, making it less a social lubricant than simply a safe and mildly nourishing liquid. The family ate quickly and without ceremony. There were no separate courses, no elaborate table settings. Food was eaten from wooden bowls or trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that served as plates, and were themselves eaten at the end of the meal, or given to animals, or to the poorest who gathered at the door. Spoons were the primary eating utensil. Forks were not yet part of the common table culture. Hands were used freely. Meals were practical, not social events in the modern sense, though conversation and community certainly existed around them. After the meal, there was work still to be done. The evening hours were not idle. Women spun thread by the light of the fire, the hand spindle, and later the spinning wheel, occupied countless hours of female labor across the medieval period, as the production of cloth was a constant household necessity. Men might repair tools, mend harnesses, or work on any of the thousand small tasks rural life demanded. Children who were old enough helped with whatever was needed. Babies, if they existed in the household, were held, nursed, and rocked by the standards of what we know about medieval timekeeping. Night was a significant portion of the 24-hour cycle. In late autumn at the latitudes of England or northern France, the sun set before 5 in the afternoon and did not rise until well after 6 in the morning. More than 13 hours of darkness, without artificial light beyond fire and tallow candles, which were expensive and used sparingly. The hours of darkness imposed themselves on human activity. Work that required good eyesight, the close work of sewing or reading, became difficult or impossible. Life slowed. People talked, prayed, told stories, simply sat together in the warmth and dark. Sleep itself was different in the medieval world. Modern sleep science recognizes a phenomenon called biphasic sleep, a pattern of sleeping in two distinct segments, separated by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. Historical research, particularly the work of Roger Kirch, has demonstrated convincingly that this was the norm in pre-industrial Europe. People would sleep for a few hours after dark, wake for an hour or around midnight, which they might pray, talk, have sex, eat, or simply lie quietly, and then sleep again until morning. The young uninterrupted 8-hour sleep that modern people take as the natural standard is actually a product of artificial lighting and industrial schedules. Medieval people, living by the rhythms of natural light and fire, slept and woke in a fundamentally different pattern. Tonight, in this peasant house, the family has settled toward sleep. The children are curled together for warmth. The fire has been banked, the coals covered with ash to slow their burning and sustain heat through the night, without consuming too much fuel. The animals stir in their end of the longhouse. The smoke hangs in the air. Outside, the night is absolute, the stars brilliant and cold in a sky without light pollution, the village utterly dark. But not everyone in the village sleeps yet. And the village is not alone in this landscape. BUM3. Surf in G say Uyel Kutlugu Sakanalatant there is a man who cannot sleep. His name, let us say, is Thomas and Thomas, a name common enough in medieval in England that it serves well as a placeholder for the anonymous millions whose lives were documented. If at all, only in the most oblique ways. Tax records, court rolls, the occasional notation in a manorial account. Thomas is a villain, a serf in the language of feudal law, which means that he is legally bound to the land he farms. He cannot leave his village without the permission of his lord. He owes labor service on the lord's demesne fields, typically 2 or 3 days a week, and more during planting and harvest. In exchange for this obligation, he holds his strips of land in the open field system and has access to common resources. The shared meadow for his animals, the woodland where he can gather deadwood for fuel. Thomas is approximately 40 years old, which in the medieval context means he is an older man. Life expectancy statistics for the medieval period, complicated and often misunderstood. The frequently cited life expectancy of 35 years is a mean average that is dragged sharply downward by the devastating mortality of infancy and early childhood in some periods and regions. Perhaps a third of all children died before their 5th birthday. An adult who survived teeny had a reasonable chance of living into their 50s or 60s. But those decades were hard ones. The body bore the marks of labor, of illness, of nutritional deficiencies, of injuries never properly treated. Thomas's hands are damaged by decades of work. His back aches. His teeth are worn and several are missing. By modern standards, he looks 20 years older than he is. Tonight he cannot sleep because he is worried. The harvest was not as good as it needed to be. A wet summer. The rains came too heavy in July, when the grain was ripening, damaged a portion of his crops before they could be brought in. He has calculated and recalculated. After the Lord's rent, after the tithe paid to the parish, after setting aside the seed grain he will need, full need for next spring's planting, his remaining stores of grain are less than they should be. They will last until perhaps February, maybe March if the family is careful. After that, there will be months before the next harvest comes in, months when they will need to buy grain, if they have the money, or beg, or go hungry. This was the grinding arithmetic of peasant life, the gap between harvest and spring, what historians sometimes call the hungry gap, or the 6 weeks want, was a structurally built-in feature of the medieval agricultural year. Even in good years it was difficult. In bad years it was catastrophic. And in the worst years, when the harvest failed across a wide region, when the price of grain rose beyond the reach of the poor, when the cold was too severe and the stores too depleted, people died. The famines that struck northern Europe in the early 14th century, particularly the Great Famine of 1315 to 22, killed millions. But those disasters were the extreme expression of a vulnerability that existed every single year, in every single village, in the chest-tightening worry of men like Thomas, as they lay awake in the smoky dark. Thomas gets up carefully, trying not to disturb his wife and the 3 children still young enough to share the family sleeping space. The old ones have their own corner. He wraps himself in a rough woolen cloak, not his best one, but warm enough, and moves toward the door. The fire is just coals now, giving off a dull redness in the darkness. He has something to check: the grain in the storage chest, or what remains of it. He has checked it twice today already. He checks it again now, by feel in the dark. Runnings hang his hands through the grain, with an almost ritualistic compulsion. He steps outside. The cold hits him immediately. Not the killing cold of deep winter, but the sharp, damp cold of an autumn night that promises worse to come. The village is silent. The houses are dark masses, barely distinguishable from the darkness around them. A dog barks somewhere, alarmed perhaps by a fox or an owl, then falls silent. Above, the stars are extraordinary, the Milky Way a bright smear across the black sky, Orion just rising in the east. Thomas knows by name, not as a constellation, as a sign. When Orion stands high overhead at midnight, the worst of winter is approaching. The village night was not empty of movement. Though most people were asleep or abed, certain activities happened under cover of darkness. Poaching was one of them, the game that moved through the fields and forests. Deer, rabbits, pheasants belonged legally to the lord of the manor or to the king. The hunting of them by peasants was a crime punishable by fines, mutilation, or worse in earlier periods. The forest laws of Norman England were particularly brutal. Under William the Conqueror, the killing of a king's deer could be punished by blinding or castration. These laws were relaxed somewhat over the centuries, but the basic principle remained. Wild animals were a resource reserved for the elite, and a peasant who snared a rabbit for his family's pot was a criminal in the eyes of the law. Yet poaching happened constantly. It happened because families were hungry. It happened because a rabbit represented a meal. Meal was an abstraction, but a physical necessity. The medieval peasant who crouched in the dark, the edge of a woodland, setting a snare with practiced fingers, was not defying the law of ideology or bravado. He was feeding his children. Historical court records are full of poaching cases. Ordinary people caught, fined, caned, occasionally imprisoned. But the records also suggest that village communities generally protected their own in these matters. Neighbors did not easily betray each other to the Lord's officials. Thomas is not poaching tonight. He is simply standing outside in the cold, looking at his village and his night, carrying his worry like a stone in his chest. In a little while he will go back inside, lie down, and fall into the first of his 2 sleeps. But for now he stands and thinks about the winter ahead. Peasants had stood and thought about the winter ahead since before anyone could remember. The medieval peasant's relationship with nature was direct and unmediated in medias, in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend from the vantage point of the modern world. Weather was not an inconvenience or a topic of casual conversation. Was life and death. A late frost in April could destroy the early seedlings. A dry summer meant poor grain yields. A wet autumn meant difficulty getting the harvest in before it rotted in the fields. An early and severe winter meant that animals weakened by insufficient fodder began to die, representing not just a loss of food, but a loss of the labor and capital that the animals represented. Medieval people were extraordinarily attentive to natural science because their survival depended on reading the landscape correctly. They knew the patterns of birds and insects, the behavior of clouds and winds, the signs and the behavior of their animals. This knowledge was practical and accumulated over generations, passed from parent to child, from neighbor to neighbor, embedded in the proverbs and sayings that filled the folk wisdom of the age. When the wind is in the west, the weather is at its best, or dozens of similar formulations, some accurate, some not, but all reflecting a deep engagement with the natural world that was inseparable from the demands of agricultural survival. Thomas goes back inside. He pulls his cloak tighter and lies down. He prays briefly, simply, in the way of a man who prays as a daily habit, rather than a dramatic gesture. He asks, essentially, for enough food, enough. The prayer of the medieval peasant was not typically the elaborate theological formulation of the churchman. It was direct, personal, and focused on the concrete necessities of bodily existence. This is not to say it was not sincere. It was deeply sincere. God, Thomas, was not a distant abstraction, but an immediate and constant presence. And the Virgin Mary and the saints were intercessors who could be petitioned with the same directness one might use to petition a powerful Lord. He closes his eyes. The fire's warmth is barely enough. He is tired in a way that goes beyond the fatigue of a single day. It is the accumulated tiredness of a life of labor, a tiredness that lives in the bones. But sleep, when it comes, is deep and dreamless. Belum quarter, Monaster, Yeti Vakit, Vigesinen Kalbi 3 miles from the village, on a slight rise of ground above a small river, stands a monastery. It is not a large one, perhaps 20 or 25 monks, living under the rule of Saint Benedict, which has governed Benedictine monastic life since the 6th century. The buildings are stone, solid and well-maintained compared to the wooden and thatched structures of the village. There is a church, the heart of the complex, a cloister, a chapter house, a refectory, where the monks eat their meals in silence while a reader recites scripture or the lives of the saints, a dormitory, a kitchen, and various outbuildings for the practical work of the community. The monastery is awake. Or rather, it has just been awakened. The monk's day was structured around the Deva office, the 7 canonical hours of prayer that divided the day and night into segments of work, study, and worship. These hours were not optional or occasional. They were the fundamental rhythm of monastic life, the purpose around which everything else was organized. The hours were matines, also called vigils or nocturnes, celebrated in the deep hours of the night, lauds at dawn, prime at the 1st hour of the day, terce at the 3rd hour, sext at noon, none at the 9th hour, Vespers at evening, and Compline just before bed. Of these, Matins was the most unusual. In many ways, the most demanding. Matins was celebrated in the middle of the night. Typically around 2 or 3 in the morning, the monks would be awakened by a bell, rise from their sleeping places in the dormitory, and make their way in darkness and silence to the church. In winter, this meant walking through freezing cold. At all times, it meant tearing oneself away from sleep at the most difficult hour of the night cycle. The rule of Saint Benedict was explicit about this requirement and about attitude with which should be met. The monk was to rise immediately when the signal was given, not linger in bed, and proceed to the church with dignified haste, giving no occasion for those who were sluggish to find an excuse to remain. Tonight, the bell has rung. In the dormitory, dark shapes stir and rise. The monks sleep in their habits, the long woolen robes that serve as both daywear and nightwear, and in their sandals or shoes, so that rising for the night office requires minimal preparation. They file out of the dormitory and across the cloister to the church, some carrying small lanterns, the flagstones cold beneath their feet, even through their footwear. The church at night is a particular kind of space. The stone walls absorb and hold the cold with remarkable efficiency. A large stone building in northern Europe in autumn is often colder inside than the outdoor air. The candles on the altar and in the choir stalls provide light that is warm in color but limited in reach, creating pools of illumination in a broader darkness. The monks take their places in the carved wooden choir stalls arranged on either side of the central aisle of the chancel, facing each other across the space, and the chanting begins. The chanting of the divine office was not a casual matter. It required knowledge, training, and sustained concentration. The psalms, hymns, and antiphons that constituted the office had been memorized. Novices spent yet years in this work, and a fully trained monk carried in his memory an enormous repertoire of sacred song. The chanting was done in Latin, the language of the Church, across all of Western Christendom, regardless of the monk's native tongue. A French monk chanting alongside an English monk chanted the same words in the same language to the same melodies. The universality of the liturgy functioning as a kind of spiritual and intellectual common ground that transcended the babel of vernacular languages. The musical style of this chanting was what we would call Gregorian chant, named after Pope Gregory the Great, who reigned from 590 to 604, and was traditionally credited with its organization. Though the actual development of the plainchant tradition was far more gradual and complex than this attribution suggests. Gregorian chant is characterized by its monophonic texture, a single melodic line, without harmony in the modern sense, flowing in long, unhurried phrases that follow the natural rhythms of the Latin text. It is music built for stone spaces, for darkness, for the hours before dawn. Heard in a cold stone church at 3 in the morning, it has a quality that is at once austere and deeply human. The monks chanting matins were tired. This is not a dramatic observation, but a simple one. The combination of hard physical work during the day, relatively simple food, and the constant interruption of night sleep by the divine office meant that monastic life was characterized by a persistent, managed fatigue. The rule of Benedict acknowledged this. It specified that the metin's office should be of a length that allowed the monks, after its completion, to return to bed and sleep a little more before lauds, typically an hour or two of additional sleep, which bridged the gap between the night office and the prayer. But within its tired community, there were individuals in whom the fatigue was deeper, more significant. The infirmary, the monastery's medical facility, held 3 brothers at the moment. One was old, his body simply wearing out, spending more time now in the infirmary bed and anywhere else, eating small amounts of the special food allowed to the sick, cooked vegetables, a little meat, things that would not strain a failing digestion, slipping in out of a gentle confusion. The other 2 were younger men, one with a fever, probably a chest ailment of the kind that the damp of the damp autumn air seemed to encourage, and one recovering from a fall had cracked 2 of his ribs and made every breath a careful negotiation with pain. The monastic infirmary was, for its time and context, a sophisticated medical environment. Monasteries were the primary sites of medical learning and practice in early medieval Europe. The monks who served as infirmarians had access to what medical knowledge existed, drawn from the preserved texts of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, particularly Galen and Hippocrates, whose ideas had been transmitted through Arabic translations and commentary before finding their way back into the Latin West, as well as the extensive practical knowledge of herbal medicine that had been developed and refined over centuries of gardening. The monastery garden was not merely decorative, it was functional. A well-maintained monastic garden included herbs with genuine medicinal properties. Lavender, which has mild antimicrobial effects. Mint, which aids digestion. Valerian, which has sedative properties. Garlic, which does indeed have antimicrobial qualities, and dozens of others whose effectiveness varied considerably, but whose use represented the most sophisticated medical practice. Available the medieval period. The infirmarian brewed teas, made poultices, prepared tinctures. He bled patients according to the prevailing theory of humors, that illness resulted from an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that restoring balance required removing excess fluid. Modern medicine knows that bloodletting was generally unhelpful and sometimes actively harmful, but within its own theoretical framework, it was a rational intervention, and the monastic physician brought to it the same careful, methodical attention he brought to everything else in his practice. The monk with the fever lies in his infirmary bed, sweating despite the cold. The infirmarian has checked on him twice already tonight. The fever has been running for 3 days. It is not dangerously high, not the raging fever of the great epidemic diseases, but it is persistent, and the infirmarian is watchful. He has given the sick monk a tea of elderflower and willow bark, the latter of which, we now know, contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, and does indeed reduce fever. He does not know this is why it works. He knows that it often works, because he has seen it work many times, and that knowledge, empirical and careful, is sufficient. Back in the church, Matins continues. The Psalms move in their ancient cycle. The Latin words fill the cold air. Outside, the night is at its darkest. The hour when the world feels most utterly abandoned by the light. When the distance between now and dawn seems immeasurably vast. The monks chant on. They have chanted through nights like this for decades. They will chant through nights like this until they are too old or too ill to rise from their beds. And then, in the infirmary, they will be prayed for by those who continue the office in their absence. The chain of prayer in the monastic imagination was unbroken. Somewhere in Christendom, at every moment of every hour, monks were chanting the divine office. The world was held in a continuous net of praise and petition, even through its darkest nights. Bubulan sing, Kailul, Soilu eviven ishentingishuk. Let us climb the hill now, to the castle that sits above the village and monastery, commanding its view over the dark countryside. The word castle conjures images of vast stone fortresses, the great Norman keeps of England, the turreted chateau of France. And indeed, such structure it existed, built by the most powerful lords with access to enormous resources of labor and capital. But the typical castle of the middle medieval period was something more modest. A stone tower, perhaps 4 stories high, with a great hall at the center of the complex, surrounded by a stone curtain wall, a wooden palisade, or an earthen bank as additional defense. The whole thing set within a cleared space, the castle's defensive zone, with the village and its fields spread below. The lord of this particular manor is a knight, a man of a lesser nobility, not a great magnate, but a competent and reasonably prosperous lord of a medium-sized estate. He holds his land in exchange for military service to the earl or baron above him in the feudal hierarchy, which means that for a specified number of days per year, and his burden. The horse, the armor, the weapons, the training, all of these are enormously expensive. And maintaining his status as a knight in good standing consumes a substantial portion of his estate's income. Tonight, the great hall of the castle is not the scene of a feast. Feasts, in the popular imagination, define the medieval aristocratic experience. And they did occur at certain seasons, and on certain occasions, as elaborate and sometimes extravagant displays of wealth, generosity, and status. But feasts were exceptional events. Ordinary nights in a castle were considerably quieter, and the dinner that has been cleared away this evening was a substantial, but not particularly thickly theatrical affair. Roasted meat. The castle had access to game and livestock that the peasants below could not afford, accompanied by white bread, wine rather than ale, and a variety of preserved and fresh vegetables. The Lord's diet was genuinely better than the peasants' in terms of protein and variety. He could afford meat regularly, beef, mutton, pork, and game. And the castle kitchen had access to a wider range of ingredients, including imported spices that were used both to flavor food and to preserve it. Spices, in the medieval period, were luxury goods of the first order: black pepper, cinnamon, flour, cloves nut. These came from the Far East via the trade routes that wound through the Middle East and then into the Mediterranean, passing through the hands of Muslim and Vengeance before reaching the markets of Northern Europe. By the time a bag of pepper reached London or Paris, it had crossed half the world and changed hands many times, and its price reflected this journey. Pepper was literally worth its weight in silver at certain times and places. The use of spices was not, as is sometimes claimed, primarily a means of masking the smell of rotting meat. This is a persistent myth. A lord who served rotting meat to his guests would have been embarrassed, humiliated. The quality of the table was a public statement of status and hospitality. Rather, spices were used for the flavor they genuinely imparted, for the prestige their expense represented, and for what were believed to be their medicinal properties. Medieval medical theory, drawing again on the Galenic framework of humors, assigned hot, cold, moist, and dry qualities to different foods, and the skilled cook was expected to balance the qualities of a dish so that it was both delicious and healthful. The lady of the manor, the knight's wife, is awake at this late hour, not by choice, but by circumstance. She is pregnant, perhaps 7 months along, and the pregnancy is not comfortable. This is her 4th pregnancy. First child died in infancy, as so many did. The second is a boy of 8, healthy and lively. The third, a daughter of 5, is also healthy. If this 4th child survives and is healthy, she will have done what was expected of her in terms of producing heirs. If it does not survive, there will be another pregnancy and another attempt. The mortality of women in childbirth was one of the great shadows over the medieval world. Infection, specifically puerperal fever, caused by bacterial infection of the uterus after delivery, killed a significant proportion of women who gave birth. Without antiseptics, without antibiotics, without an understanding of germ theory, the hands that assisted at a birth might carry the very agents of death. The best midwives of the period were experienced, skilled, and capable of managing many of the mechanical complications of birth. But against bacterial infection they had no defense, and neither did anyone else. A woman who survived to 40, having borne several children, had navigated a genuine and repeated mortal risk. The lady moves carefully around her chamber, a room that is large by the standards of the village, but cold and stark by modern standards. Tapestries hang on the walls, more for insulation than decoration, though they serve both purposes. A fire burns in the fireplace. A real fireplace with a chimney, one of the markers of noble domestic space. She cannot sleep. The baby moves. Her back ages. She sits by the fire and asks her maidservant, who sleeps in the same room, to bring her something warm to drink. The maidservant, a girl of perhaps 17, the daughter of a local craftsman who has come into service in the castle, rises without complaint and goes to the kitchen. The castle kitchen is still warm. The great fire that had heated it for the day's cooking has banked coals that maintain a residual warmth for hours. She heats wine, spiced wine, with ginger and cinnamon and a little honey, the kind of warm drink that was considered beneficial for pregnant women and their unborn children. She carries it back carefully through the dark corridors of the castle. The lady sips the wine and feels, temporarily, a little better. The warmth spreads through her. She is not suffering in the way that Thomas in his peasant house is suffering. Hunger is a passing discomfort at the end of an adequate meal. Her fatigue, the normal discomfort of late pregnancy, rather than the bone-deep exhaustion of physical labor. But she is not safe from the night's dangers. No one in this world is safe from the night's dangers. The Lord himself sleeps, or tries to. He is worried about different things than Thomas is worried about. His worries are about the upcoming military campaign. His overlord has announced a dispute with a neighboring lord over a strip of contested land, the kind of quarrel that could escalate into actual fighting. He worries about the cost of equipping himself and the 2 men-at-arms he is obligated to provide. He worries about a debt he owes to a moneylender in the nearby town, a debt taken on to repair the castle's main tower after a storm brought down part of the curtain wall. The medieval knight was not the carefree romantic figure of later literary imagination. He was a man managing a complex set of obligations, debts, and relationships within a system that was demanding and unforgiving. He also worries, though he would not have the vocabulary to express this, about status, about maintaining his position in the social hierarchy, about being seen as a man of sufficient honor and capacity. Honor in the medieval aristocratic world was not a sentimental concept. It was a social reality with material consequences. Who was seen as dishonored? Who had broken an oath? Who had been publicly humiliated? Who had failed in a military obligation? Faced real consequences in terms of his relationships with his lord, his peers, and his dependents. The maintenance of reputation, a constant, active project. He pulls the heavy woolen blankets more tightly around himself and eventually drifts into an uneasy sleep. Outside his window, the darkness is complete. The village below is invisible. The world has contracted to the small warm space of the bed. The sound of the wind against the stone walls, the occasional creak of the great hall's timbers settling in the cold. Bielum's Sice. Or main, Jesse Iacta Jesanaler. Not everyone in this medieval night is safely enclosed within walls. There are people in the forest, on the roads, in the open spaces between settlements, who have no roof over their heads and no fire to warm them. The medieval landscape was not uniformly settled. Between the villages, between towns, between the castles, lay vast stretches of forest, heath, and marsh. The waste, as it was sometimes called, a term that meant not destroyed, but rather uncultivated and unenclosed. Neither farmed nor formally claimed, The forest was, in the medieval imagination, a profoundly ambiguous space. It was both resource and danger, both refuge and wilderness. It provided timber for building and fuel, game for those who could legally take it, acorns and beech mast for the pigs who were driven into the woods each autumn to fatten on the fallen nuts, a practice called pannage, governed by its own seasonal customs and legal regulations. But the forest was also the place beyond civilization, the space outside the social order, where outlaws fled, where bandits lurked. The dangers, both real and imagined, multiplied in darkness. Tonight there are travelers on the road. A road in medieval Europe was not, for most of its length, the paved surface that the word suggests to modern ears. The great Roman roads, the Via Appia in Ea, the roads of Britain that still bear their ancient names, were the exceptions. Most roads were simply the most traveled paths through the landscape. Rutted tracks that became rivers of mud in wet weather, dusty and bone-jarring in dry weather, but the essential arteries of movement and trade that connected the dispersed communities of the medieval world. Two merchants are making their way along such a road tonight. Or Trent. They have miscalculated their journey. They expected to reach the next town before dark, but a delay in the afternoon, a wheel on their pack horse's load they did needed repair, a necessary detour around a flooded section of track has left them out in the open as night fell. They have a lantern, but it casts a very limited light. The road ahead is a barely visible track through the trees. They are cold, tired, and increasingly anxious. Medieval travel was genuinely dangerous in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. The danger was not purely from other humans, though that danger was real. It was also from the simple fact of being lost, of being exposed to the elements, of being far from any help if something went wrong. A horse that threw a shoe, a traveler who broke an ankle, a sudden violent storm, any of these could transform a journey into a crisis. The merchants knew this. Everyone who traveled any distance knew it. The merchants, connective if tissue of the medieval economy, and it required courage as well as commercial acumen. Merchants moved goods, wool, cloth, spices, metals, wine, between the specialized production centers where things were made and the markets where they were sold. This movement was essential. A medieval English town might produce surplus wool, but it needed salt fish from the coast, wine from Gascony, and linen from Flanders. These exchanges required people willing to remove goods over long distances, managing the risks of robbery, accident, bad weather, and the complex tangle of tolls and customs duties that every lord, bishop, and town council exacted from passing trade. The merchants tonight are carrying wool. English wool, the finest in Europe, for the production of high-quality cloth. They are taking it to a market town, where it will be sold to a cloth merchant, who will send it on to the cloth-making cities of Vrunders, Ghent, Ypres, or to the Italian merchants who had established themselves as major players in the English wool trade by the 13th century. The Florentine banking houses of the Bardi and the Peruzzi, among others, had effectively bankrolled the English crown in exchange for favorable wool trading rights, creating financial relationships that spanned half the continent. But these grand commercial networks are very far from the minds of the two merchants huddled together on the dark road tonight. They are thinking about finding shelter. They have found it barely. A woodcutter's hut, abandoned for the season, at the edge of the forest. It is small, it leaks, it smells of old ash and animal, but it has 4 walls and a roof and enough old wood to build a small fire. They have lit the fire. They have eaten a cold meal from their packs, hard bread, dried meat, a small flask of wine. They are going to spend the night here uncomfortable and cold, and continue their journey at first light. This, a common experience for medieval travelers. The network of inns, monasteries, offering hospitality to travelers, and town accommodations was real and functional. A traveler on a well-oiled route in a prosperous region could generally find lodging for the night. But this network was not universal. In rural areas, in periods of political disorder, in bad weather that made planned stops impossible, travelers frequently improvised. They stayed in barns, in farmhouses, where the hospitality of the householder extended to offering a space by the fire, in forest shelters, or simply in the open with their cloaks wrapped around them. The danger of the forest night was real, but should not be overstated. Organized banditry, gangs who preyed systematically on travelers, was a genuine problem in some areas and periods, particularly in regions where the breakdown uncontrolled authority left travelers unprotected. The roads of England, France, and all saw periodic waves of highway robbery, and the authorities, royal, noble, and ecclesiastical, took this seriously as a problem that impeded commerce and threatened public order. But the routine experience of most travelers, most of the time, was not violent robbery, but simply the discomfort and uncertainty of movement through a landscape where help was not always close at hand. The merchants hear an owl. One of them flinches slightly, then recovers himself with a small, embarrassed laugh. Owls had an association, in the medieval folk belief, with bad fortune and with death, was a widespread and ancient superstition, not specific to the medieval period but deeply embedded in it. Medieval people did not sharply distinguish between natural and supernatural events. The world was full of signs and portents, of spiritual forces that moved through material reality, of messages encoded in it in the behavior of animals and the patterns of weather. An owl calling on the night road was not merely a bird vocalizing. It was a communication from a world beyond the visible, and its message was ambiguous at best. They bank their small fire and wrap their cloaks more tightly and try to sleep. The forest settles around them, full of sounds that are entirely natural. The wind in the branches, the movement of small animals, the distant barking of a fox, but which the human mind, in the dark, tends to interpret as something more threatening. They will sleep badly tonight. In the morning, they will be stiff and cold and foul-tempered. But they will be alive, and they will reach their market. And the transaction they complete will be one small thread in the great web of medieval commerce. Biwilum 7, Kaiden Hikiam Jesse Ayata Tutin Biljalig in the village. There is someone who has not slept at all tonight. Her name is Margaret. Or rather, she is called Old Margaret, to distinguish her from the various younger Margarets in the community, though she is not so very old, perhaps 55, which is indeed old for this world. She is the village midwife, herbalist, and general practitioner of folk medicine. She is not a physician in the formal sense. Formal physicians trained at universities, and the universities, which were a relatively new institution in this period, did not admit women. But Margaret has a knowledge of the human body, of the properties of plants, of the management of Ellen's illness and childbirth, that her community cannot do without. Tonight she has been called to a birth. A young woman, this her first pregnancy, went into labor in the late afternoon, and the labor has been long and difficult. Margaret has been here for 6 hours, monitoring, guiding, encouraging, and worrying. The baby has not come yet. The labor is progressing, but slowly, and the young woman is exhausted. Medieval childbirth took place in the home, attended by women. The father was not present. Childbirth was a female space, and the management of them entirely in the hands of the midwife and the female relatives and neighbors who gathered to support the laboring woman. This was partly cultural convention and partly practical. In a world without formal medical training, for most practitioners, the accumulated experience of women who had attended many births was the most reliable guide available. Margaret has attended perhaps 100 births over her long career. She has seen most of what can go wrong, and she knows what she can manage and what she cannot. Manage. What no one in this world can manage is the catastrophic obstetric emergency. A baby in a position that makes vaginal delivery impossible, a placenta that separates before the birth is complete, a hemorrhage that cannot be controlled. In these situations, the skilled medieval midwife could do, and often it was not enough. The mortality of women But tonight things are difficult rather than catastrophic. The baby's position is not ideal, but not impossible. The young woman is exhausted but not in immediate danger. Margaret applies her knowledge methodically. Shivan, the laboring woman, a tea of raspberry leaf, which was believed, and there is some modern evidence to support, to strengthen uterine contractions. She has positioned her in ways that she knows from experience to be helpful. She speaks to her calmly and directly, telling her what is happening and what she needs to do, the kind of practical, honest coaching that labor requires. The woman supporting Margaret is a neighbor, a mother herself 3 times over, who has seen birth before and is calm and steady. They work together with the easy coordination of shared knowledge and mutual trust. The fire is built high in the room where the birth is happening. The need for warmth, for it is paramount. and the room is deliberately heated to a level that would be uncomfortably hot for ordinary purposes. As the night deepens toward its midpoint, the birth happens. The baby, a boy, comes into the world in the small hours of the morning, screaming immediately, which is best possible sign. Margaret receives him, clears his airways, wraps him. The young mother reaches for him, and Margaret places him on her chest, skin to skin, which she knows without knowing the modern scientific vocabulary, or it is the right. There is a moment of intense relief in the room. The neighbor woman is weeping quietly, which seems disproportionate until you understand that she is weeping for all the births that ended differently, that added with silence rather than screaming, that ended with the quiet departure of a priest carrying the oils for last rites, rather than the exhausted joy of a healthy newborn. The contrast, in a world where the alternative was so common and so close, creates an emotion that has no simple name. Margaret packs her herbs and instruments and gives careful instructions to the neighbor about the young mother's care in the next few days. She is bone-tired. She has been on her feet for 7 hours, concentrating intensely, bearing the weight of someone else's life in her hands. She will walk home through the dark village, let herself into her own small house, and sleeps as soon as her head touches the rolled-up cloth that serves as her pillow. She will not think about payment. She will be compensated eventually, in goods rather than money, in whatever the family can spare. This is how it works. Margaret's role in the village represents a kind of knowledge that was essential to medieval community life, but that left few formal records. She was not writing treatises. She was not training formally at an institution. Her knowledge was transmitted orally and practically, woman to woman, across generations. It was vulnerable to the death of individuals who carried it, but it was also robust in a certain way. It was tested constantly against reality, refined by experience, and embedded in a community that depended on it. Herbalist and midwife, who survived and maintained her reputation, did so because her methods worked, at least often enough to matter. The academic medicine of the medieval period. The university-trained physicians with their Galenic theory and their elaborate urinalysis was largely inaccessible to the village population. It was expensive, available only in towns, and its theoretical sophistication did not always translate into pure and superior practical outcomes compared to the folk medicine of experienced practitioners. The debate between full and informal medical knowledge was real and sometimes acrimonious in the medieval period, with university-trained physicians attempting to assert their authority and suppress competition unlicensed practitioners. But in the rural village, the unlicensed practitioner, often the only option available, Biel Winuit, Seer, Ser, Jeansealery, Vixillery, Viffer, V, Fifer, Claudol, and the castle and the monastery are enclosed in their night. A few miles away there is something quite different. A town, not a great city, not Paris or London or Cologne, with their tens of thousands of inhabitants and their complex commercial lives, but a market town of perhaps 2,000 or 1,000 people, the kind of a settlement that served as the commercial and administrative hub for the surrounding rural area. It has a weekly market, a few dozen permanent indent shops, a guild hall, a church that is considerably larger and more elaborate than the village church, and the beginnings of the kind of urban institutions that would eventually transform medieval European society. The town at night is not a village at night writ larger. It has its own distinctive nighttime character, governed by its own rules and institutions. Most medieval towns had a curfew, literally, a cover fire bell rung at a specified hour in the evening, after which fires in homes and workshops were supposed to be banked or extinguished, and citizens were supposed to be indoors. This was not primarily about crime control, though that was as a consideration. It was about fire. Fire was the existential threat to the medieval town. Towns were dense, crowded, built largely of timber, and their close-packed structures created conditions in which a fire that started in one building could consume an entire neighborhood before it could be controlled. The great fires that periodically destroyed medieval towns. London in 2012, and then again most famously in 1666. Though that post-dates our period, were not accidents in the sense of being unpredictable. They were the predictable consequence of building dense insulation wood without adequate fire prevention. The curfew bell had rung hours ago. Most of the town's population is indoors, if not asleep then at least enclosed. But the town is not entirely quiet. The night watch is making its rounds. A group of men, typically citizens drafted into service on a rotating basis, who patrol the streets through the night hours. Their function was to watch for fire, to challenge strangers, to maintain order. They carried lanterns, and in some towns, horn lanterns, translucent, of horns, scrimped, thin enough, light, while protecting the flame from wind. The medieval watchman on his rounds is a figure who appears frequently in the literature and records of the period, often in comic roles. The night watch of medieval drama and story tends to be depicted as bumbling, halfling, half asleep, and easily distracted, but who served a genuine and important function. One building in the town is deliberately and productively awake: the bakehouse. The baker has started his fire hours ago. The bread that will feed the town tomorrow must be ready at first light, and bread making is a long process. The dough has been mixed and left to rise. The oven, a large, stone-built, dome-shaped structure capable of holding dozens of loaves at a time, has been heated by burning wood inside it for several hours. At the right moment, the burning wood is raked out. The oven's surface is tested for temperature by the baker's practiced hand, and the loaves are loaded in to bake. The medieval baker was a figure surrounded by regulation. The quality of bread was so central to urban food supply. Bread was literally the primary caloric source for most of the urban population, that its production was closely controlled. Town bakers, subject to what was called the assize of bread and ale, a system of regulations that specified the price, weight, and quality of bread in relation to the current price of grain. If a baker sold loaves that were underweight or of quality, The penalties were severe and publicly humiliating. The offending baker might be strapped to a sled and dragged through the town streets with the offending loaf tied around his neck. This was not merely a punishment, but a demonstration, a public performance of the community's standards and its enforcement of them. The baker is not thinking about the size of bread as he works tonight. He is thinking about the grain price, which has risen since last month's market, and about whether he needs to adjust the size of his loaves accordingly. He is thinking about his assistant, who is young and sometimes careless about the timing of the oven. He is thinking, with one part of his mind, about his wife, who is unwell. Nothing serious, he hopes, a cold that has settled in her chest. And up whether she has enough blankets. The bakehouse is warm, heated by the great oven to a temperature that is comfortable even on a cold October night. The smell of baking bread, the building, and drifts out into the street. If the night watch passes this way, they will notice it, and perhaps pause for a moment, warming themselves in the ambient heat. The smell of bread baking in the night is one of the few genuinely plain features of this particular nocturnal world. In the marketplace itself, the wide open space at the center of the town that will be crowded with buyers and sellers from first light tomorrow, there is nothing but darkness and the occasional movement of cats, which are the town's primary rodent control strategy. The stalls that will be set up in the morning are stored elsewhere. The space is empty, a void at the heart of the human settlement, waiting for the day to fill it again. In the streets around the marketplace, however, there are a few people who have no indoor space to shelter in. The medieval town had a population of what modern scholarship calls the mobile poor, people without fixed homes, without regular employment, without the network of community ties that provided a safety net for the settled population. Beggars, vagrants, unemployed laborers, the mentally who had no family to care for them, escaped serfs trying to establish themselves in a new place. These were the people who occupied the margins of the urban space. They slept in doorways, under murk stalls, in the warmth of the bakehouse ends. In the churchyard, the church allowed it. The church's obligation of charity to the poor was a genuine and articulated value in medieval Christianity. The hospitals and almshouses, founded by religious institutions throughout the medieval period, were concrete expressions of this value. Major monasteries maintained a guest house and provided food to the poor, who gathered at their gates. Town guilds often had provisions for the relief of members fallen into poverty, but the system was inadequate to the scale of the need. The mobile poor in any medieval town far exceeded the capacity of charitable institutions to house and feed them. And the experience of poverty in a cold October night in the streets of a medieval town was brutal and real. Biulu Maiv, Sabat, C. Dunionianus. The night is not permanent. Even the longest medieval night, in the depths of winter, eventually yields to morning. And now, in this particular night we have been watching, this autumn night, cold and dark and full of the quiet transactions of sleep and waking, of worry and prayer and labor, the sky at the eastern horizon is beginning to change. The change, almost imperceptible at first, not light, exactly, but the withdrawal of the absolute darkness, a slight, gray indefinite brightening at the edge of the world that the eye strains to be sure it is really seeing. And then, gradually, undeniably, the shapes things emerge from the dark. The outline of the hill against the sky, the bulk of the forest, the darker darkness of the village houses against the slightly less dark sky. The monastery bell rings for lauds, the office of dawn praise, song as the light returns to the world. This is the prayer that celebrates the resurrection of light, the daily miracle of morning, the death and rebirth that the Christian imagination saw in the cycle of day and night. The monks who have returned from matins and slept for an hour or two now rise again, file again through the cold cloister, take up again their places in the choir, and begin again to chant. Their voices, rough with sleep, warm as the office proceeds. The psalms of dawn are different in character from the psalms of midnight. More jubilant, more outward-looking, moving from darkness toward light. In the village, Thomas has been awake for 20 minutes already. He did not need to be roused. His internal clock, calibrated by decades of early rising, woke him as it always did. In the gray time before dawn, when the light was yet sufficient for work, but when the day was clearly beginning. He has already tended the fire, bringing the coals back to life, adding wood, building the warmth back up, bahop, in the house that has cooled through the night's sleeping hours. The wife is awake too, beginning to organize the morning. The children stir. There is bread left from yesterday. There is ale. There is a small amount of the pottage, reheated now over the renewed fire. The morning meal in a peasant household was not elaborate. It was a refueling, quick and practical. Before the day's work began, Thomas will be in the field as soon as noon. Is there enough light to work? And the light comes quickly once it begins. The short days of late autumn mean that every hour of usable daylight is precious. The animals fed. The pigs that had been kept overnight in the yard are let out to root. The chickens that live in a small pen beside the house merge into the morning, blinking and clucking to scratch in the muddy ground for whatever they can find. The cow. Thomas has one cow, which is his most valuable single animal, is checked and found to be well. Her milk this morning is not much. The autumn decline in grazing has reduced her production, but there is enough for the smallest child. In the castle on the hill, a different kind of morning is beginning. The Lord has risen early too, not because he has agricultural work to do, but because the culture of the nobility associated early rising with virtue and discipline. The servant who has slept in the great hall, ready to attend his lord, brings water for washing. The castle kitchen is already busy, preparing the first meal of the day. The pregnant lady has poorly but is resting now, and has sent word that she would prefer to eat in her chamber rather than in the hall. The knight goes to the castle chapel for morning prayer. He is not as rigorously observant as a monk, but daily prayer was a fundamental expectation of Christian life at all social levels. The chaplain who serves the castle's spiritual needs conducts a brief morning mass. The Latin words, the familiar gestures, the smell of incense and candle wax. These frame the beginning of the day in a way that connects it to all the other days, to the great continuous practice of Christian devotion. The castle, every other habitation in this landscape, participants in. The merchants in the forest hut are already on the road. They woke at first light. They had both slept badly and were glad to abandon the pretense and packed their gear quickly and efficiently. The road was visible now, just barely, in the gray early morning. Their horses, who had spent the night picketed near the hut, and who had not had a particularly comfortable night either, were saddled and loaded. The merchants did not speak much. They ate a small amount of cold food as they walked, anxious to make good time. Old Margaret is finally sleeping. The young mother and her newborn son are also sleeping in the careful, recovering sleep of the first hours after birth. The neighbor woman is still awake, watching over them, her eyes moving between the sleeping pair and the fire that she is keeping carefully maintained. She is tired but content. This is the good kind of tiredness, the tiredness that comes after something has gone right. In the town, the curfew period is ending. The streets, which had been empty of all but the night watch and the homeless poor, are beginning to fill. The bakers have their bread ready. The market traders are arriving, setting up their stalls in the marketplace, unpacking their goods, calling to each other across the open space. The animals that will be sold at market, the cattle, sheep, and pigs driven in from the surrounding farms, are beginning to arrive, their noise and smell filling the morning air. The town is coming awake as it came awake every market day, with noise and activity, and the smell of animals, and baking bread, and wood smoke and humanity. The streets that had been empty are full of purposeful movement. Deals are being struck. Prices are being argued. The specific, skilled labor of the craftsman, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the weaver, the tanner, is beginning in the workshops that lined the town's street. The night is over. The world that had contracted in the dark is expanding again in the light. The anxieties of the night are not gone. Thomas still faces the worry about the grain stores. The knight still faces his debt and his military obligations. The merchants still have miles to go before they reach their market. But they are daylight anxieties now, with the world visible and the actions of the day available to address them. The specific quality of nighttime worry, that nighttime amplification of fear, ear in the told and the cold, has been dispelled by the simple fact of morning. This is what morning meant in the medieval world. Not just the renewal of light, but the renewal of agency, the ability to see what you were doing, to move through the world, to act on the problems that darkness had only allowed you to lie still and worry about. Morning was a restoration of human capacity that a person in this landscape understood at a fundamental mental level, in their bones, in the automatic relaxation of the body's tinge that came with the returning light. Bivumdinth, Terisil, Ogisiel Miamers, Ojesu Lemamos, we have spent this long night moving through a medieval world. Oh, not the world, a world of fairy tale and romance, not the world of shining knights and damsels in distress, but the world as it was actually lived by the millions of people who built it and worked in it and prayed in it and died in it. A world of genuine hardship and genuine beauty, of remarkable ingenuity within profound constraint, of faith and fear and the daily practice of survival. What can we take from this night? This single, null night? What does it tell us about the people who lived it, and about ourselves as their descendants? The first thing it tells us is the centrality of food. The medieval world was organized at its most fundamental level around the production and distribution of food. Every social structure, the feudal hierarchy, the monastic system, guild organization of the towns, was in some way a response to the challenge of producing food to sustain the population, distributing it, and managing the vulnerability that agricultural life entailed. When the food supply failed, as it periodically and catastrophically did, the social order cracked. The great famines, the peasant revolts, the migrations of desperate people across an uncaring landscape. These were the consequences of a world where the margin between enough and not enough was always narrow. The second thing it tells us about is the relationship between light and darkness, between day and night, that shaped medieval life at the most fundamental sensory level. We live in a world bathed in artificial light, where the darkness is optional and the night is a choice rather than an imposition. The medieval person had no such option. Night was the world's actual condition for half of every day. And the psychology of living in genuine darkness, the way it shaped sleep patterns, the way it intensified fear and superstition, the way it made the return of light each morning a genuinely meaningful event, was part of the basic texture of medieval existence. The third thing is the relationship between community and vulnerability. The medieval village, monastery, castle, and town were not simply economic or administrative units. They were survival communities. The people in them depended on each other in ways that beyond the exchange of goods and services. They depended on each other for warmth in the literal sense of shared bodies in shared spaces. They depended on each other for knowledge, the midwife's skill, the elder's memory, the monk's literacy. They depended on each other for the psychological sustenance of not being alone in the dark. This dependency shaped the social world in profound ways, creating legations and networks of mutual aid that were both stronger and more coercive than anything most people in the modern world experience. We should resist the temptation to romanticize this world. The peasant's life was hard, genuinely, physically, relentlessly hard, in ways that should not be aestheticized or celebrated. The power differential between the lord and the serf, between the literate clergy and the illiterate laity, between men and women, was real and often brutal. The violence structured the feudal world, the casual use of physical force by the powerful against the powerless, the legal mutilation and execution that enforced the social order was an incidental detail, but a fundamental feature. The early death of children, the deaths of women in childbirth, the slow destruction of the body through labor and disease. These were not romantic. They were tragedies, experienced as tragedies by the people who lived through them. But we should equally resist the temptation to condescend. The people of the medieval world were not primitive, not simple, not lacking in the full range of human intelligence and emotion. They were people operating within the constraints of their time and place with as much skill, ingenuity, and care as the circumstances allowed. The monk who chanted at 3 in the morning was engaging in a spiritual practice of remarkable depth and sophistication. The midwife who delivered a baby by firelight was drawing on a body of practical knowledge assembled o'er generations of careful observation. The peasant who lay awake, worrying about his grain stores, is performing the same cognitive exercise, assessing risk, planning ahead, managing anxiety, that his descendants perform today with spreadsheets and financial planning apps. The medieval world also created, in its long centuries, the foundations of things we still have. The universities of Europe, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, were medieval institutions founded in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Gothic cathedrals that still stand in France, England, Germany, and Spain are medieval achievements, representing extraordinary feats of engineering, art, and organized labor. The common law tradition of England, which forms the basis of legal systems across much of the world, was developed in the medieval period. The parliamentary institutions that evolved in England and elsewhere during the 13th and 14th centuries were the ancestors of the representative government that we now take as a democratic norm. These achievements were not made by abstractions. They were made by people, by monks who copied manuscripts through cold nights, by stonemasons who calculated the stresses on cathedral arches without modern engineering mathematics, by lawyers who argued about the limits of royal power in the context of a legal tradition. They were simultaneously practicing and creating. The night we have watched is the night of these people too. The tired monk chanting matins will, in the hours of his daytime work, be copying a text that preserves ancient knowledge through what would otherwise be a gap of centuries. The knight lying awake worrying about his debts is part class whose political conflicts with the English crown will eventually produce Magna Carta. The merchant sleeping badly in the forest hut is a participant in the commercial revolution that is slowly transforming the European economy and creating the conditions for the modern world. History, when we look at it closely and honestly, is not a story of inevitable progress or inevitable decline. It is a story of people doing what they can, what they have, in the specific circumstances of their time and place, with results that are always mixed, and whose significance is often not apparent until long afterward. The medieval night, hungry, cold, long, and full of both fear and faith, is not a night we would choose to relive, but is a night worth understanding, because the people who lived it were our ancestors in the most direct sense possible, and the world they built, with all its flaws and all its achievements, is the world Dies Mordius. Morning is fully here now. The sun has risen, pale, autumn thin, but unambiguously present. Over the ridge to the east, the monastery bell rings for prime. The village is fully awake and at work. The castle gates are open. The town market is in full cry. The merchants are on the road again, cold and stiff but moving forward. The night is over. The world goes on.